What's going to drive 2019? We've put up 4 things here. In my view, the biggest single driver for 2019 is what happens to the elections. As I said, we will look at the elections in 2 dimensions. One dimension is it successful or not? The second dimension is who wins. Guess what? If it's not successful, who wins is irrelevant. And so for me, the biggest single factor driving 2019 is going to be, does Nigeria next weekend have a successful elections? If we do, we'll have a new conversation after. If we don't, it's going to be a very interesting conversation. But then, so elections, number 1. Number 2, Nigeria is an oil story at the heart of it. No matter what you say, Nigeria is an oil story. They say Nigeria is oil rich. I say Saudi Arabia is oil rich. Nigeria is oil dependent. If you do the numbers, roughly 800 million barrels of crude oil annually. If there are 200 million of us, then it means each person is entitled to 4 barrels of crude oil every year. But do the Saudi numbers. Let's be conservative. The Saudis do 10 million barrels of crude oil daily. And that's being conservative, by the way. So, 4 billion barrels. And they have 30 million people to share it. So for succeeding in waking up every morning, each Saudi is entitled to roughly $6,000 US. Now you can decide which one is oil rich and which one is oil dependent. And yet, the circumstances of oil don't look good. Remember the point I made earlier, that oil price in the budget laid out is $61. I don't expect oil prices to average $61 in 2019. I expect them to average less than $61. My sense, even though I'm not an oil economist and I will always bow to the superior knowledge of those who are, is that somewhere around about $50 to $55 is probably what we will see. Again, remember my point about 2.3 million barrels of crude oil being our assumption. Our OPEC numbers mean we will only do approximately 1.9 million barrels. You do the maths. You don't need to be a genius. Our revenue challenges are going to be exacerbated in 2019. What then does that mean? The government will borrow more. Interest rates will therefore be higher. So anybody who's expecting interest rates to come down anytime soon, I think you're probably not going to see that. Beyond that, international risks, slower growth, monetary tightening, again, all speak to higher interest rates and pressure for the naira to absorb. And then, of course, the final point for us about what will drive 2019 is going to be what's the domestic policy story. If the budget as laid before the National Assembly today is where we are at fiscally, it's a smaller budget than it was in 2018, which means fiscal policy is already tightening. We expect monetary policy to remain tight, notwithstanding the fact that the monetary policy rate of the central bank has remained unchanged for quite a while. But nonetheless, through its reserve management, the central bank has managed to keep monetary conditions rather tight and therefore interest rates rather high. Whoever wins will have to appoint a new governor for the central bank. Whoever wins will have to start saying things around policy almost as soon as they have won. At that point, then we will be able to come to some judgment about where we go from here. Well, this is simply telling you the budget, and in my view, this budget doesn't hold. Something's got to give, and the only thing that I can see given is that we will have to borrow more in 2019. Therefore, interest rates will be higher. And as I'm sure you all know here, interest rates, just another yield on capital. Those who run exchanges, I feel for them. It doesn't matter whether it's the NASD or whether it is the stock exchange. simply because putting your money in government instruments in an election year is almost a no-brainer. Given that the internationals have already taken a back seat and aren't like, people tend to think, oh, once the elections are over, the internationals are back. I say be careful. The internationals will come back, but on two conditions. One, successful elections. But secondly, we've got to be speaking to policy directions that actually make sense. In my view, currently Nigeria sits on a major fiscal dilemma. If the figures are right, we are spending between 600 billion and 1.5 trillion on fiscal under-recovery on the sales of petrol. If you are running fiscal under-recovery, anything between 600 billion and 1.5 trillion, and your budget deficit is almost 6% of collected revenues, then you've got to start asking, can you really afford to be so fiscally generous? And by the way, whatever else doesn't happen in 2019, everybody in this room must expect to pay more taxes. Nigeria's fiscal yield is roughly 7% of GDP. Even Afghanistan, war-ravaged as it is, does better. The African average is about 16%, and indeed some African countries are doing as high as 40% of GDP in terms of government revenues. We cannot continue for much longer to complain about how government doesn't do this, doesn't do that, doesn't do the other, and yet refuse to pay taxes. By the way, I also must put on the table that the government too has to come to the party. Because there was a deal that the Nigerian people and the government have kept, but the government is varying its terms. And what's the deal? We, the people, will not ask questions about oil, provided you don't ask us for taxes. Now they are asking about taxes, they must be ready to answer more transparently what happens to oil money. So, but be that as it may, get ready to pay more taxes. What else? Where do I think we end? For me, I don't see us growing significantly, probably looking at growth at about 2%, 2.5% at best. And if we are going to grow, what are the imperatives? The imperatives are very simple, really. Number one, make sure that agriculture does not continue with the sluggish growth that we're seeing. Currently, we are looking at agriculture, Q3 2018, 1.9% growth. Agriculture must get to about 4.5%, 5% growth at the earliest possible time. And there's a major challenge, because I don't think enough people look at the numbers closely enough. In 2010, 30% of Nigeria's labor force was in agriculture. In 2017, Q3, 48% of Nigeria's labor force was recorded as being in agriculture. Now that is very contrary to what economics requires. Economics says you take labor out of agriculture, put it into industry where it earns better, productivity rises in agriculture. What we have done is to reinforce poverty, because by putting more people in agriculture, what we have seen, and yet agriculture is not growing at the pace it needs to. Indeed, if you look at the per capita production in agriculture today, it is about 17% less than it was in 2010. And therefore, even the sustainability of our food security and the rest of it really is in doubt. Again, I'm clear. I've left the exchange rate pretty much where it is, not because I think that's where it should be. As I said earlier, I think the exchange rate is about 10%, or the currency is about 10% overvalued. However, no government with its brain in the right place will do anything about exchange rates, not before an election, and certainly it's unlikely to do anything before a new central bank governor or the confirmation of the incumbent as continuing governor of central bank. What else then? GDP growth slow. Inflation. My sense is this, that yeah, these figures suggest roughly where we are. But please, make allowance that if we choose to stop, or if we choose to recover fuel prices, then inflation will go up. In other words, if instead of hemorrhaging between 600 billion and 1.2 trillion of naira flows by underpricing for fuel, then inflation will have to go up. It's a spike, probably go to as high as 13%. But you know what's the problem with inflation and growing higher than that? The demand side of the economy is extremely weak. And before you say to me, oh, but wage increases, please bear in mind the following. 30,000 is what's proposed at the federal level. 27,000 is what is proposed for states and companies, I think, who have employees more than 25. What I do fear, though, is given what I said about corporates under pressure, might higher wages tilt them into the direction of higher unemployment as an adjustment mechanism. These are going to be questions that you captains of industry will have to answer.